Naturally, Halloween nights should mean candy and costumes, fun and laughter. But for some families, October 31st became the last day they saw someone they loved. In this video, we will be looking at 10 horrifying cases, 10 different Halloween nights, and 10 times when the scariest things present weren't wearing masks. Stay with me, because what connects these stories isn't just the date. It's how evil can hijack even the most innocent traditions, and how some of these killers walked free while their victims never got real justice. Case number 1. Ronald Clark O'Brien, the Candyman. Timothy O'Brien was 8 years old in 1974, and he loved Halloween the way most kids do. He lived in Deer Park, Texas, with his parents Ronald, who served as a deacon at Second Baptist Church, where he sang in the choir and managed a local bus program, and Daneen, his mom, plus his younger sister Elizabeth. Timothy was a typical third grader who enjoyed school, playing with friends, and looked forward to trick-or-treating every year. October 31st, 1974 started like any normal Halloween. Ronald O'Brien took Timothy and Elizabeth, along with some neighborhood kids, out for candy collection around their suburban streets. The group walked from house to house, bags filling with treats, as darkness settled over the neighborhood. But Ronald had a problem nobody knew about. He owed money to multiple creditors, and he'd recently taken out life insurance policies on both his children. The policies were worth $10,000 each, significant money in 1974. And Ronald had made a plan that would shock everybody. During the trick-or-treating route, Ronald separated from the group briefly. He chose to stay back at a house where no one answered, then rejoined the children moments later with 5 21-inch pixie sticks in his hands. He gave one to Timothy, one to Elizabeth, one to a neighbor boy named Mark, and 2 to children from his church. The pixie sticks looked normal from the outside, those long paper tubes filled with colorful sugar that kids could pour straight into their mouths. But these weren't filled with just sugar. Ronald had carefully opened each tube, mixed in potassium cyanide powder, and resealed them. When they returned home that night, Timothy wanted to eat some of his Halloween candy before bed. Ronald encouraged this, even helping Timothy with the pixie stick since the powder seemed clumped at one end. Timothy complained that it tasted bitter. His father helped wash it down with Kool-Aid. Within minutes, Timothy began vomiting. He screamed that his stomach hurt, and then he started convulsing. Daneen called for an ambulance while Ronald performed CPR on his son, but nothing helped. Timothy collapsed in the hallway of their home. Paramedics rushed Timothy to the hospital, yet doctors couldn't save him. Timothy O'Brien died less than an hour after eating the poisoned candy. A pathologist who examined the pixie sticks determined that the one Timothy ate contained enough cyanide to kill 2 adults, while each of the other 4 had enough to kill 3 to 4 adults. Police immediately grew suspicious when they learned about the pixie sticks. They tracked down the other 4 children who'd received the poisoned candy and recovered all 4 tubes before anyone else could eat them. Each one contained lethal amounts of cyanide. Ronald had tried to poison 5 children to avoid suspicion falling solely on his own family. As the investigation progressed, police discovered that Ronald O'Brien was over $100,000 in debt, the equivalent of about $640,000 in 2024, and had a long history of struggling to keep a job. In the 10 years before the crime, O'Brien had worked at 21 different places. At the time of his arrest, he was suspected of theft at his job at Texas State Optical and was close to being fired. His car was about to be repossessed. He had defaulted on several bank loans, and the family home had already been foreclosed on. Police also found that O'Brien had taken out life insurance policies on his children in the months leading up to Timothy's death. In January 1974, he purchased $10,000 life insurance policies for each of his 2 children. 1 month before Timothy's death, he added another $20,000 policy on both children, even though his insurance agent advised against it. In the days just before Halloween, he took out yet another $20,000 policy on each child. Altogether, the policies totaled approximately $100,000, equal to about $638,000 in 2024. O'Brien's wife insisted she had no knowledge of these insurance policies on their children's lives. Investigators also learned that on the morning after Timothy's death, O'Brien contacted his insurance company to ask about collecting on the policy he had taken out on his son. They later discovered that shortly before Halloween of 1974, O'Brien had visited a chemical supply store in Houston to buy cyanide, but left without making a purchase after learning that the smallest amount available was 5 pounds. Police never discovered when or where O'Brien bought the poison he used in committing the crime. The house where Ronald claimed he'd received the pixie sticks became another crucial detail. Police interviewed the homeowner, who said he'd been at work during trick-or-treat hours, and his wife confirmed no one had knocked on their door that evening. The lights had been off because no one was home. Ronald had fabricated the entire story about receiving the candy from a stranger. Ronald's own daughter, Elizabeth, helped seal the case against him. She told investigators her father had been unusually insistent that she eat the pixie sticks that night, even though she'd said she wasn't hungry. Only her stubbornness about wanting to save it for later had kept her alive. Prosecutors charged Ronald with capital murder. The trial began in May 1975, just 7 months after Timothy's death. The evidence was overwhelming. The financial motive, the insurance policies, the lies about where he'd gotten the candy, and the fact that he'd tried to poison 4 additional children to create the appearance of a random killer targeting trick-or-treaters. The jury deliberated for over an hour. They found Ronald guilty, and the judge sentenced him to death. Appeals dragged on for nearly a decade, but every court that reviewed the case upheld the conviction. Even Ronald's own attorney admitted there was no question about his client's guilt. Ronald O'Brien was executed by lethal injection on March 31, 1984, exactly 9 years and 5 months after Timothy's death. He never showed remorse. In his final statement, he simply said he hoped his death would bring closure to everyone involved. Timothy's murder changed Halloween forever. Parents became terrified of poisoned candy, and hospitals started offering free X-ray services to check treats. The fear spread nationwide, even though actual cases of stranger poisoning were incredibly rare. Ronald had created a myth that would haunt Halloween for generations. The media called him the Candyman and the man who killed Halloween. But what Ronald really killed was his own son, for insurance money he never collected and debts he thought he could escape. Timothy O'Brien was 8 years old, excited about candy and Halloween, but his father murdered him due to his dark intentions and lack of paternal love. If you think Timothy was a victim of circumstance, let me know below. What would you have done differently if you'd noticed a friend, sibling, or parent tried to poison you for their personal gain? Case number 2, the Liske family massacre. 16-year-old Devin Griffin thought he was walking into a Halloween prank on October 31st, 2010, after returning home from his church choir concert. He arrived at his family's home in West Chester Township, Ohio, expecting to find his family preparing for the holiday. Instead, he found real blood in the bedrooms and 3 members of his family dead. The victims were his mother, Susan Liske, 46 years old, his brother Derek Griffin, 23, and his stepfather William Liske Sr., 53. Derek had been bludgeoned to death with a hammer while he slept. Bill and Susan had been shot multiple times while they slept in their beds. The killer had moved through the house methodically, executing each victim before they could react or call for help. Devin had spent the previous night at his biological father's house. That Halloween morning, he came home around 10 o'clock to quickly change into his choir clothes for a concert at church. He noticed his stepbrother BJ outside loading things into Bill's white F-150 pickup truck. BJ asked him what he was doing home and how long he'd be there, which struck Devin as unusual since the two typically avoided each other. Devin told him he just needed to change and was heading back to church. After the concert, Devin returned home around 11:15 that morning and went straight to his room to play video games. Around 1 o'clock that afternoon, Devin's Aunt Lori called him. She'd been trying to reach Derek and Susan all morning. Derek was supposed to help his uncle with some work that day, but never showed up, which wasn't like him. Devin realized the house was eerily quiet. He turned off his video game and went to find his parents. When he entered their bedroom, he saw them in bed and thought it was strange they were still sleeping at 1:30 in the afternoon. They were both early birds. He tried to wake his mother, but she wasn't moving. Her eyes were black and blue, and she was stiff. When he pulled back the covers, he saw blood everywhere. For a fleeting moment, his brain tried to convince him this was an elaborate Halloween prank, but he knew the horrible truth. Devin immediately called his Aunt Lori back. She called 911 and rushed to the house. When police arrived, they found a horrific scene. Bill and Susan's bedroom was covered in blood spatter. Bill had been shot 4 to 5 times in the head. Susan was face down with her legs hanging off the bed, shot 3 times in the head. There were no signs of struggle. Both appeared to have been asleep when shot. Evidence also indicated Susan had been sexually assaulted either right before or right after her death. Police searched the rest of the house and found an upstairs bedroom with the door locked. They forced their way in and discovered Derek in his bed with devastating blunt force trauma to his head. His skull was cracked open, and based on the blood spatter, investigators determined he'd been struck at least twice with what they believed was a hammer. He was still in the fetal position, killed in his sleep. Because 2 different methods were used, police quickly determined Derek was killed first with the hammer, so Bill and Susan wouldn't be awakened by the sound of gunshots. Then the killer went downstairs and shot them both. There were no shell casings at the scene. The killer had taken time to clean up. Both bedroom doors had been closed, with Derek's locked. The neighbor, Michelle Gradell, told investigators she'd heard 3 banging sounds around 6:30 that morning. When detectives interviewed Devin about BJ's presence that morning, they knew they had to find him. BJ's cell phone was turned off. Officers checked his mother's house 15 miles away, but he wasn't there. Police then learned about the family cabin in Carroll County and put out a be on the lookout alert. Investigators quickly learned there had been significant tension in the Liske home for years. The problem started after Bill and Susan married in 2001, when Susan and her 2 sons moved in with Bill, and BJ, who'd had the run of the house before, suddenly had rules to follow. Susan required him to actually attend school, which led to constant conflicts. BJ had a long, troubled history with mental health issues and law enforcement. In 2002, at age 16, he attacked police officers who responded when he threatened to harm himself. In 2004, he assaulted Susan, hitting her in the chest. 2 months later, he was charged with felonious assault and kidnapping after hitting Susan with a coffee cup and stealing her car keys, but was found incompetent to stand trial. BJ moved to a group home in Sandusky, living there during the week, but staying at the family home on weekends. In 2007, he was hospitalized and diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type, and put on medication. When BJ was 18, Bill kicked him out permanently after he attempted to attack Susan while she was in the shower. Deputy Michael Balash found the white F-150 at the family cabin. As he pulled in, BJ stepped onto the front porch to smoke a cigarette. The deputy drew his weapon and ordered BJ to the ground. After being read his rights, BJ said he'd been at the cabin about 3 hours, but refused to answer further questions. Police noticed brown and red stains on his socks and shoes. In the truck, investigators found a .22 caliber rifle consistent with the wounds on Bill and Susan. Bloodstains covered the vehicle. Back at the Liske home, police found the bloody hammer used to kill Derek hidden under a safe in a closet. The footprints found on the dock by the pond matched BJ's shoes. The actual confession came from a recorded phone call between BJ and his mother. When she asked how he could do this, he said he wasn't in his right mind. After this call, BJ changed his plea to guilty. In August 2011, BJ pleaded guilty to 3 counts of aggravated murder. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty and recommended life without parole. At sentencing, BJ said, "I loved my dad very much, and it makes me feel sick every time I think about what I did. I can't really explain why this all had to happen, but I think most of all, it had to do with my mental illness." Judge Bruce Winters sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. BJ's defense attorney noted that while BJ was deemed legally sane, he was clearly mentally ill. It was unknown whether he'd taken his medication the night of the murders, but he had been drinking alcohol. On March 15, 2015, 5 years after the murders, BJ Liske was found dead in his cell at Ross Correctional Institution from self-inflicted wounds. He was 29 years old. His defense attorney wasn't surprised, stating that facing life without parole, combined with BJ's severe mental health problems, made the outcome tragically predictable. He suggested BJ might have been better suited for a mental health facility rather than prison. Devin Griffin testified at sentencing about losing nearly his entire family in one night. He described finding the bodies, calling for help, and learning his own brother had murdered everyone. Years later, Devin reflected that BJ wasn't a monster. The family had tried to help him, but may not have had the necessary understanding to help him the way he needed. The Liske family murders shocked their suburban Ohio community. The Halloween of 2010 became the night when Devin Griffin lost his mother, his brother, his stepfather, and effectively his older brother too. All because severe mental illness, left inadequately treated, transformed into homicidal rage that destroyed an entire family. Case number 3. Martha Moxley. The Greenwich murder. Martha Moxley, born on August 16, 1960, was 15 years old. Blonde and popular, living in the wealthy neighborhood of Belle Haven in Greenwich, Connecticut. She'd moved there from California with her family just 2 years earlier, and she'd quickly made friends among the privileged teenagers in her area. October 30th, 1975 was Mischief Night, the evening before Halloween when kids traditionally played pranks. For Martha, it would be the last night of her life. Martha spent that evening with a group of friends, moving between houses in Belle Haven, ringing doorbells and pulling pranks like toilet papering houses. Around 9:30 that night, she arrived at the home of the Skakel family, who lived just across the street from the Moxleys. The Skakels were even wealthier than most families in the neighborhood. They were related to the Kennedy political dynasty through Ethel Kennedy, who had been born Ethel Skakel and was the widow of United States Senator Robert F. Kennedy. 2 Skakel brothers were home that night, 17-year-old Thomas and 15-year-old Michael. Both boys knew Martha from the neighborhood, and both would later become suspects in her murder. Martha flirted with Thomas that evening, and according to friends, she eventually kissed him. Martha was last seen falling together behind the fence, with Thomas near the pool in the Skakel backyard at around 9:30 that night. But around 9:45, Thomas went inside the house, leaving Martha outside. What happened next remained a mystery. Martha's mother realized she was missing when Martha failed to come home that night. A search began immediately, but darkness made it difficult to cover the neighborhood thoroughly. The next day, Halloween, Martha's body was discovered beneath a tree in her family's backyard, not far from her own house. She'd been beaten to death with a 6-iron golf club, which had shattered from the force of the attack. The killer had then stabbed Martha through the throat with the broken shaft of the club. Her pants and underwear had been pulled down, though the medical examiner found no evidence of sexual assault. The golf club was a crucial clue. It was traced back to the Skakel residence, and one club, the 6-iron, was missing from their collection. Police immediately focused their investigation on the Skakel household, particularly on Thomas and Michael. Thomas Skakel was the last person seen with Martha on the night of the murder. He became the prime suspect, admitting he'd been with Martha that evening, but he claimed he'd gone inside around 9:45 and never saw her again. He had no alibi for the rest of the night. However, his father forbade access to his school and mental health records. Kenneth Littleton, who had started working as a live-in tutor for the Skakel family only hours before the murder, also became a prime suspect. Michael, meanwhile, told police he'd been at his cousin's house several miles away when Martha was killed, but his story had inconsistencies that investigators noted. The Greenwich police investigation stalled almost immediately. The Skakel family hired expensive lawyers who limited what the brothers could be asked. Evidence wasn't processed promptly. Witnesses were not interviewed thoroughly. No one was charged, and the case went cold within months. Martha's murder remained unsolved through the late 1970s, all through the 1980s, and into the 1990s. Martha's mother, Dorothy Moxley, refused to give up. She pressed police for answers year after year, but the department seemed unable or unwilling to break through the wall of silence and legal protection surrounding the Skakel family. The case became an example of how wealth and connections could shield suspects from accountability. When William Kennedy Smith was tried and acquitted for rape in 1991, a rumor surfaced that he had been present at the Skakel house the night of Moxley's death. Although this proved unfounded, it resulted in a new investigation of the then cold case. The Sutton Associates, a private detective agency hired by Rushton Skakel in 1991, conducted its own investigation. The Sutton report, later leaked to the media, revealed that both Thomas and Michael had altered their stories about their activities the night of the murder. Over the years, both Thomas and Michael Skakel significantly changed their alibis. Michael claimed that he had been window peeping and masturbating in a tree beside the Moxley property from 11:30 in the evening to 12:30 in the morning. Two former students from Elan School, a treatment center for troubled youths where Michael had been sent in 1978 for alcohol problems, testified they heard Michael confess to killing Moxley with a golf club. One of the former students, Gregory Coleman, testified that Michael was given special privileges and had bragged, "I'm going to get away with murder. I'm a Kennedy." In 1993, author Dominic Dunn published A Season in Purgatory, a fictional story closely resembling the Moxley case. Mark Fuhrman's 1998 book, Murder in Greenwich, named Michael Skakel as the murderer and pointed out numerous mistakes made during the original police investigation. Everything changed when these books renewed public interest in the case, and former classmates came forward with information about Michael's alleged confessions. In June 1998, a rarely invoked one-man grand jury was convened to review the evidence. After an 18-month investigation, it was decided there was enough evidence to charge Michael Skakel with murder. On January 9, 2000, an arrest warrant was issued, and Michael Skakel surrendered to authorities. He was released shortly thereafter on $500,000 bail. On March 14, 2000, Skakel was arraigned for murder in a juvenile court, since he was 15 years old at the time of Moxley's murder. On January 31, 2001, a judge ruled for Skakel to be tried as an adult. Skakel's trial began on May 7, 2002, in Norwalk, Connecticut. Prosecutors argued that Michael had been jealous of Thomas's interaction with Martha that evening, so after Thomas went inside, Michael attacked Martha with the golf club from his own family's set. The brutality of the beating suggested a personal rage, not a random attack. Prosecutors presented testimony from multiple witnesses who said Michael had confessed over the years. During the trial, the jury heard part of a taped book proposal Michael had made in the early 1990s, which included Skakel speaking about masturbating in a tree on the night of the murder, possibly the same tree under which Moxley's body was found. In the book proposal, Skakel did not admit to committing the murder, but prosecutors used words from it and overlaid them on graphic images of Moxley's dead body in a multimedia presentation shown to jurors during closing arguments. Defense attorneys argued the evidence was circumstantial and the witnesses were unreliable after so many years. They suggested other suspects had never been properly investigated, including Kenneth Littleton, the Skakel family tutor. But the jury didn't buy it. On June 7, 2002, Michael Skakel was convicted of Martha Moxley's murder. The judge sentenced him to 20 years to life in prison. He was assigned to the Garner Correctional Institution in Newtown, Connecticut. After 27 years, Martha's family finally had a measure of justice. But the case wasn't over. Michael's attorneys filed appeal after appeal. In November 2003, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. wrote a controversial article insisting that an innocent man was in prison and that Kenneth Littleton should have been investigated more thoroughly. Skakel continued to fight his conviction through multiple appeals, all of which were denied by various courts through 2010. Then, on October 23, 2013, a Connecticut judge granted Skakel a new trial, ruling that his trial lawyer, Michael Sherman, had been incompetent and failed to adequately represent him. The judge wrote that Sherman's failures were significant and ultimately fatal to a constitutionally adequate defense. Michael Skakel walked out of prison on November 21, 2013. Released on $1.2 million bail after serving 11 years. He was required to wear a GPS monitoring device and could not leave Connecticut without permission. In December 2016, The Connecticut Supreme Court reinstated Skakel's conviction with a 4-3 majority decision, writing that his conviction was the result of overwhelming evidence and that his legal representation had been adequate. But the legal battle continued. On May 4, 2018, the Connecticut Supreme Court reversed itself and vacated Skakel's conviction entirely, ordering a new trial. The court ruled that Sherman had rendered ineffective assistance when he failed to contact an alibi witness whose name had been provided by Skakel. Finally, on October 30, 2020, exactly 45 years after Martha's murder, the state of Connecticut announced it would not retry Skakel. Chief State's Attorney Richard Colangelo informed the court that the state would not be able to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt after so many years. Dorothy Moxley, Martha's mother, was devastated. She'd waited decades for justice, seen a conviction, and then watched it slip away due to legal technicalities and the passage of time. While the case officially ended without a final conviction, many people, including Martha's family, continue to believe Michael Skakel killed her. Martha Moxley was 15 years old. She was excited about Halloween the next day. She trusted the wealthy neighborhood where she lived to be safe. And she was beaten to death with a golf club just yards from her own home, likely by someone she knew and trusted. The fact that wealth and family connections may have helped her killer avoid permanent accountability makes her death even more tragic. Case number 4. The Napa Valley. Halloween murders. Leslie Mazzara and Adrienne Insogna. 26-year-old Leslie Ann Mazzara and 26-year-old Adrienne Insogna had moved to Napa Valley, California, to focus on their careers and build new lives. The wine country seemed like the perfect place, peaceful, beautiful, and safe. In the 2 years before 2004, there hadn't been a single homicide in Napa Valley. But Halloween night of 2004 would change everything for their quiet neighborhood on Dorset Street. Leslie had grown up in South Carolina, raised by her single mother, Kathy. She'd been a beauty queen, crowned Miss South Carolina at one point, and she was described by everyone who knew her as bubbly and outgoing. Leslie had recently gone through a breakup and decided to make a fresh start in California when her mother moved to Berkeley. She'd gotten a job as a greeter at a winery run by Francis Ford Coppola, the famous director of The Godfather. Adrienne was originally from Calistoga, about 45 minutes north of Napa. She'd graduated from California Polytechnic State University just 3 years earlier with a degree in civil engineering, and she worked for the Napa Sanitation District as an assistant engineer. Adrienne had survived a near-fatal car crash in 1994, and she'd celebrated the 10th anniversary of what she called the day she was supposed to die, just months before Halloween, with her best friend Lily Prudhomme. They'd spent the day at an amusement park, taking time off work to celebrate Adrienne's survival. The two women were very close. They went to the gym together, worked together, and had been planning a trip to Australia together. Leslie and Adrienne shared a house on Dorset Street with a third roommate, 27-year-old Lauren Menza. Lauren was an accomplished athlete with a political science degree. The three women had created a comfortable home together, and things seemed to be going well. Just a few days before Halloween, on October 28th, there'd been a small conflict when Leslie brought home a boyfriend, and they'd been loud enough to disturb the other roommates. It was the first time any of them had brought a man home, and they'd sat down afterward to discuss boundaries and establish some house rules. Everyone had agreed, and the tension had passed quickly. On Halloween night, the three women spent the evening handing out specially prepared treat bags to trick-or-treaters in their neighborhood. Neighbors would later describe seeing them around the house that evening, wearing jeans and gray sweatshirts, seeming happy and having fun together. By 11 o'clock that night, the porch light was off and all three women had gone to bed. Adrienne and Leslie had upstairs bedrooms next to each other, while Lauren's bedroom was downstairs near the back of the house. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Lauren woke up to the sound of her dog, Chloe, a golden retriever, growling. The security sensor light outside had come on, and Lauren's first thought was that it might just be a cat passing by. Then she thought maybe one of her roommates had invited someone over. After all, they'd just discussed house rules about boyfriends. But then Lauren heard the sound of breaking glass. And then she heard screaming. "Please, God, help me! Somebody help me!" The voice was Adrianne's, and it was terrified. Lauren jumped out of bed and stood near her doorway, listening. She could hear what sounded like a struggle happening upstairs. Then she heard heavy footsteps coming rapidly down the stairs toward her. Terrified, Lauren ran out the back door into the fenced yard, where she hid in the darkness. The screaming continued. Adriana was still crying for help. Lauren heard someone climbing out a window and fleeing the scene. When things went quiet, Lauren crept back inside the house, trying to call 911 on the home's cordless phone. The phone didn't work. Lauren went upstairs to check on her roommates, and what she found was a scene of unimaginable horror. Leslie was lying face down in a pile of clothes, unconscious, with stab wounds covering her upper body. The pool of blood beneath her was about 2 inches deep. Behind Leslie, on the bed, was Adriana. She was barely alive, bleeding badly, unable to speak. She had bruising on her body and defensive cuts on her hands. She'd fought back against her attacker. Lauren realized both women were either dead or dying. Afraid the intruder might return, she ran to her car and called 911 from her cell phone. A police officer who'd been patrolling nearby arrived within minutes, but it was too late. Leslie Ann Mazzara and Adriana Insogna were both dead. The investigation that followed revealed how the killer had entered the home. He'd forced open the kitchen window to get inside, cutting himself on the broken glass in the process. He'd left blood behind, his blood, on the window, on a wallboard, and on the window blinds. Police also found cigarette butts near the house. The brand was Camel Turkish Gold, and DNA testing on the saliva showed it came from a Caucasian male. The DNA from the blood matched the saliva on the cigarette butts. 71 pieces of evidence were collected from the home. The murders marked the first double homicide in the area since 1998, and the community was terrified. Women who worked at the local wineries and tourist venues were especially frightened. Many of them were young and lived alone or with roommates, just like Leslie, Adrienne, and Lauren. The FBI was called in to help. Within days, a $100,000 reward had been established for information leading to an arrest and conviction. Police told the public they believed the killer had known at least one of the victims. Investigators interviewed more than 1,300 people. They collected 218 voluntary DNA samples from men who'd had contact with the victims. Police looked into Leslie's ex-boyfriends, Adrianne's boyfriend, Christian Lay, and dozens of other potential suspects. Christian was questioned extensively, and his home was searched in the middle of the night, but DNA testing cleared him completely. He had nothing to do with the murders. The investigation seemed to hit dead end after dead end. Months passed with no arrest. Leslie's mother and Adrianne's mother both spoke to the media, pleading for information. Adrianne's best friend, Lily, expressed frustration that no one had been caught. "Someone must know something," she said. She believed the killer's behavior had to have been obvious to anyone who knew him. There were even wild theories floating around. Some people thought the murders might have been drug-related, or even a mob hit because of the Italian last names. In February 2005, 3 months after the murders, Lily Prudhomme married her fiancé, Eric Koppel. They'd been engaged for years and had originally planned a wedding in Hawaii, but those plans had been canceled. They'd gotten back together and decided life was too short to keep waiting. At their wedding, Lily played Adriana's favorite song, "She Will Be Loved," in her friend's honor. Adriana's mother, Arlene, even attended the wedding and read scriptures for the couple. On their wedding day, Lily told reporters she couldn't get beyond the fact that there'd been no arrest in Adriana's murder. "Somebody must know something," she said. "Somebody would have had to notice their friend acting strange or had bruises. Doesn't seem like someone could walk away from it acting fine." The breakthrough finally came in September 2005, almost 11 months after the murders. Police publicly released information about the cigarette butts found at the scene, specifically that they were Camel Turkish Gold cigarettes, and that they believed the perpetrator might have been a chain smoker who'd stood outside the home waiting for the opportunity to attack. After this information became public, Eric Koppel wrote a note to his parents saying he was planning to end his life because he'd been involved in the murders. In the note, he alluded to being jealous of Adrienne and Lily's friendship. Eric's family convinced him to turn himself in instead. 1 month after the cigarette information went public, Eric arrived at the Napa police station with Lily, his parents, and other family members. He was interviewed by detectives for 5 hours, and during that interview, he made statements that authorities viewed as a confession. The arrest shocked everyone who knew the case. Eric Koppel was 26 years old, the same age as the victims. He'd worked as a land surveyor and had no criminal record. He'd been present at the impromptu housewarming party when Adrienne and Lauren first moved into the Dorset Street house. He'd attended both women's funerals. He'd even attended Adriane's mother's home, expressing sympathy and grief. Everyone who'd known Eric described him as a chain smoker, but most people saw him as quiet and shy. Some neighbors, however, called him unfriendly and an odd duck. Police revealed that Eric had once worked for an engineering firm that had the Napa Sanitation District as a client, the same place where Adriane worked. That's how he'd first met her. According to what Eric told police, he and Lily had been arguing on Halloween night, 2004. They'd attended separate parties and had gotten into a fight about their relationship. Eric said he went home drunk and passed out. Later that night, he woke up and, for reasons he claimed he couldn't fully explain, grabbed a knife and some zip ties. He drove to the Dorset Street house. Eric told detectives he smoked a cigarette near the garage, which is when the security sensor light came on. He used his knife to pry open the kitchen window, cutting himself on the broken glass as he climbed through. He said he went upstairs and into Leslie's bedroom, where he lay down in a pile of clothing. When Leslie woke up and turned on the light, she startled him. Eric said he jumped onto the bed and thought Leslie might have hit him because he blacked out. He claimed he then heard sounds from Adriane's room next door and went in there. He said his eyes had been closed the entire time and he didn't remember attacking anyone. Eric admitted that when he got home, he burned his clothes and shoes in his backyard and ditched the knife, but he claimed he didn't remember anything else. His story was hard to believe. Prosecutors argued that the murders had been carried out with planning and surveillance, not by someone who'd stumbled drunk into a random house. Eric Koppel was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, multiple murders committed in the same time frame, and murder committed with a knife. This made him eligible for the death penalty. Eric's defense attorneys didn't deny that their client had been at the scene or that the DNA belonged to him. Instead, they presented a mental illness defense, arguing that Eric had been depressed and suicidal at the time of the murders. They worked with the victims' families to negotiate a plea deal that would spare everyone the trauma of a lengthy trial. On December 6, 2006, more than 2 years after the murders, Eric Koppel pleaded guilty to both murders. In his final plea, he admitted that he had planned the attacks and that he'd lain in wait outside the house. At his sentencing hearing, Eric spoke directly to the families. "I cannot fathom an explanation for my sinful deeds. The terrible agony inflicted upon a great number of people. My relationship with Lily was in jeopardy and crashing. It was all like it fertilized the seed of anger in my heart. There was rage inside me. If I had only listened to those who pleaded with me to get the help I needed." Adriane's mother, Arlene, spoke in court about the extent of her daughter's injuries. "My baby never wore a turtleneck sweater in her life, and yet she had to be buried in one, and still, it could not hide the extent of her wounds." Lily Prudhomme also spoke in court, describing her husband as having a gentler side and expressing her continued support for him, despite what he'd done. Her loyalty shocked many people, but she maintained that she loved the man she'd married. In exchange for his guilty plea, Eric received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. He agreed to waive all rights to appeal and to never speak to the media. If Eric ever violates this agreement, his sentence could be reviewed, he could face the death penalty, and he could be liable for $10 million in wrongful death benefits to the families. The true motive for the murders has never been fully confirmed. The contents of Eric's suicide note to his parents were never publicly disclosed. Some theories suggest Eric was jealous of Adriane's close friendship with Lily and feared it was pulling Lily away from their relationship. Another theory, mentioned in the book Nightmare in Napa by Paul LaRosa, suggests that Leslie might have been the real threat, that Eric may have made a pass at Leslie and was terrified she would tell Lily about it, which would have destroyed their relationship completely. What is clear is that on Halloween night, 2004, Eric Koppel's jealousy and rage turned deadly. Two innocent young women who'd done nothing wrong except live in the same house and be friends with Eric's fiancée were brutally stabbed to death in their beds. Lauren Mianza survived only because Eric never went downstairs to her room. Lauren gave an interview to the Napa Valley Register in 2006, saying that seeing Eric sentenced to life in prison helped her healing process begin. She's maintained a low profile since then. Lily Prudhomme Koppel has remained married to Eric and still lives in the Napa Valley area. Adriani's mother, Arlene, has stayed close with Lily over the years. Leslie's mother, Kathy, has spoken about the devastating loss of her daughter. When you lose a child, it's like a nuclear bomb has dropped. Your world becomes a barren landscape where nothing grows. It's as if all your landmarks are gone, and you don't know where you are anymore. It's taken me a very long time to find my way. She also explained why the families agreed to the plea deal instead of pursuing the death penalty. By the time of the sentencing hearing in 2007, my sons no longer felt they wanted the death penalty. We made it clear to the prosecution that we didn't want to endure a public trial, and if they could work out a plea agreement, then we would prefer it. Kathy described an extraordinary moment in the courtroom. As the media left the court, Rosemary whispered, "Kathy, do you want to meet Eric's mother?" I was absolutely terrified, but when I saw her coming towards me, I knew I needed to. She was trembling, more terrified than me. I was stunned by how similar we looked, and thought, oh my God, I'm her. Then we just embraced, and there was such relief and compassion in that embrace. Eric Koppel is currently serving his sentence at Pleasant Valley State Prison in Coalinga, California. He was 26 years old when he murdered Leslie Mazzara and Adriana Insogna. They were also 26 years old, young women with their whole lives ahead of them, careers they loved, and plans for the future. Leslie had dreams of building a career in the wine industry. Adriana had survived a car crash that should have killed her a decade earlier, only to die at the hands of her best friend's husband on Halloween night. The Napa Valley murders remind us that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones closest to us. The friend of a friend, the person at the wedding, the quiet guy who seemed a little odd but harmless. Eric Koppel walked among the grieving families, attended the funerals, expressed sympathy, all while knowing he was the one who'd taken those two lives. The fact that jealousy and insecurity could drive someone to such brutal violence shows how toxic emotions, left unchecked, can destroy innocent lives. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe justice should take its full course when innocent lives are taken. Only people who think anger justifies murder won't. Case number 5. Yoshihiro Hattori, a mistaken identity. Yoshihiro Hattori was 16 years old, excited about American culture, and dressed as John Travolta's character from Saturday Night Fever. The Japanese exchange student was staying with a host family in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and the Halloween of the year 1992 was his first American Halloween. It would also be his last night alive. Yoshi, as his friends called him, had spent months looking forward to that evening. He'd carefully prepared his costume and planned to attend a Halloween party with his host family's son, Webb Haymaker. The party was being held at a house in a nearby subdivision, and the two teenage boys set out on foot around 8 that evening. But Yoshi and Webb had the wrong address. They approached a house on Pumpkin Lane, thinking it was the party location, when actually, the party was at a different house nearby. The home they approached belonged to 40-year-old Rodney Pierce and his wife Bonnie. Yoshi knocked on the front door. When no one answered immediately, he walked around to the carport door and knocked there instead. Bonnie Pierce opened the door, saw Yoshi in his costume, screamed, and slammed the door shut. She told her husband someone was trying to break in. Rodney Pierce grabbed a .44 Magnum revolver and went to confront whoever was outside. By this time, Yoshi and Webb had realized their mistake and were walking back down the driveway toward the street. Rodney opened the carport door and pointed his gun at the teenagers. Webb immediately understood the danger. He raised his hands and backed away. But Yoshi didn't have the same cultural context for what was happening. In Japan, civilians don't commonly own guns, and the sight of someone pointing a weapon wasn't something Yoshi had ever experienced or been trained to respond to. Rodney shouted, "Freeze!" at Yoshi. The teenage exchange student didn't understand. English wasn't his first language, and freeze wasn't a word he'd learned in his limited English lessons. Yoshi kept walking toward Rodney, possibly thinking the man wanted to talk, or the gun he held was part of a Halloween prop. Webb screamed at Yoshi to stop, but it was too late. Rodney fired his magnum at point-blank range. The bullet hit Yoshi in the chest, killing him almost instantly. The 16-year-old collapsed in the driveway of a stranger's house, dying in a foreign country because he'd knocked on the wrong door. Police arrived within minutes. Paramedics tried to save Yoshi, but the wound was too severe. He was pronounced dead on his way to the hospital a short time later. Rodney Pears told officers he'd thought Yoshi was an intruder trying to break into his home, so he'd fired in self-defense. The case sparked outrage both in the United States and in Japan. Yoshi's parents, Masaichi and Mieko Hattori, flew to Louisiana to claim their son's body. They couldn't understand how their child had been killed for simply knocking on the wrong door on Halloween night. The cultural differences between Japan's gun laws and America's made the tragedy even harder for them to process. Rodney Pears was charged with manslaughter. The trial took place in May 1993, just 7 months after Yoshi's death. Prosecutors argued that Rodney had overreacted to a situation that posed no real threat. Yoshi was a slightly built teenager in a costume who'd made an honest mistake. He hadn't been carrying any weapons or attempting to force entry into the home. Rodney could have simply stayed inside and called police if he felt threatened. Defense attorneys portrayed Rodney as a frightened homeowner, protecting his family from a perceived threat. They argued that Rodney had no way of knowing Yoshi was a harmless exchange student, just looking for a Halloween party. Louisiana's self-defense laws allowed homeowners to use deadly force if they believed their lives or property were in danger. The jury deliberated for just 3 hours. They found Rodney Pears not guilty of manslaughter. The verdict meant Rodney faced no criminal punishment for killing Yoshihiro Hattori. He walked out of the courtroom a free man, while Yoshi's parents watched in disbelief from the gallery. The acquittal devastated Yoshi's family and shocked many Americans who followed the case. How could a man shoot and kill an unarmed teenager who'd simply knocked on the wrong door and face no consequences? The case highlighted deep problems with America's gun culture and self-defense laws that seemed to value property over human life. Yoshi's parents filed a civil lawsuit against Rodney Pears. Unlike criminal trials that require guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, civil trials only need to show liability by a preponderance of evidence. In September 1994, a civil jury found Rodney liable for Yoshi's death and awarded the Hattori family $653,000 in damages. The civil verdict provided some measure of accountability, but it couldn't bring Yoshi back. His parents returned to Japan, carrying their son's ashes and a grief that would never fully heal. They'd sent their child to America to learn about a different culture and improve his English. Instead, they'd gotten a coffin and a legal system that said their son's death wasn't even a crime. Yoshihiro Hattori loved music, science, and learning about different countries. He was still very young with his whole future ahead of him, and he died because he knocked on the wrong door while wearing a suspicious costume, encountering a man who chose to shoot first and ask questions later. The fact that Louisiana's laws allowed Rodney to kill Yoshi without criminal punishment exposes how broken systems can be when they value fear over human life. Case number 6, Lisa Ann French, the Fond du Lac Halloween killer. 9-year-old Lisa Ann French was excited to go trick-or-treating on Halloween night of the year 1973. She lived in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, a small city where neighbors knew each other and parents felt comfortable letting their children walk the streets at night. Lisa left her home around 5:45 that evening, dressed as a hobo, wearing a black felt hat, a green parka, jeans with blue masking tape, and dotted freckles on her cheeks. She was supposed to meet her friend, Ann Parker, and go to an outdoor Halloween party at Pumpkin Place on East Bank Street. But Parker had been grounded and had to stay home, leaving Lisa to trick or treat by herself. She never made it to the party. Lisa's route that night took her through her neighborhood, knocking on familiar doors. She stopped for candy at a classmate's house and at the house of one of her teachers, Karen Bachnecht. But around 6 o'clock, she encountered 24-year-old Gerald Miles Turner Jr., who lived just a half block away from Lisa's family. Gerald and Lisa knew each other. Lisa often spent time with Gerald's infant child and had regular conversations with him. Gerald had even previously shared a rented side of a duplex with Lisa's family. But on this Halloween night, Gerald saw the little girl at his door and made a monstrous decision. According to Turner's later confession, Lisa rang his doorbell, said, "Trick or treat," and walked through his open doorway with her candy bag open as he came to the door. Turner and Lisa began to talk about candy, and at some point, Turner lured Lisa into his bedroom, where he sexually assaulted her. Turner said that after the sexual assault, Lisa wasn't breathing. He attempted to revive her, but was interrupted when his girlfriend, Arlene Penn, arrived home. Penn, who had been at the party Lisa was supposed to attend, arrived home around 7 o'clock that evening. Turner was wearing a bathrobe and claimed multiple times that he was sick. Penn said that Turner made several trips to the bedroom to lie down. In Turner's confession, he revealed that Lisa's body was, at that time, in the adjacent bathroom. After Penn left the residence at around 8 o'clock in the evening to visit her mother, Turner stuffed Lisa's body and clothes into separate garbage bags. In an effort to avoid leaving evidence of fingerprints, Turner wore socks on his hands when moving the body. He also wiped down Lisa's shoes and the zipper of her parka. He then drove her body to Taycheedah, Wisconsin, where he discarded her corpse in a farm field off McCabe Road, behind a barbed wire fence near a forest. When Lisa didn't return home by her 7 o'clock curfew, her mother, Mary Ann Garrick, began to worry. By 10 o'clock that night, a search party had formed and begun looking for the young girl. A massive 4-day, county-wide search was conducted, which included over 5,000 volunteers, 700 block parents, auxiliary police officers, the United States National Guard, and some of her fellow Girl Scouts. On November 3, 1973, at 11:30 in the morning, a farmer named Gerald Braun was returning home in his tractor when he discovered 2 brown plastic bags behind a barbed wire fence near the forest on McCabe Road. One bag contained Lisa's naked corpse, and the other contained the clothing from her Halloween costume. An autopsy revealed that Lisa had died from asphyxiation, though a pathologist also stated she had died from circulatory shock from the sexual trauma she endured. Lisa's funeral was held on November 6, 1973, at Emmanuel Trinity Lutheran Church in Fond du Lac. The Chamber of Commerce of Fond du Lac posted a $10,000 reward for the capture of Lisa Ann French's killer. Fond du Lac police immediately suspected Gerald Turner and began investigating him. Turner lived with his girlfriend Arlene Penn and their infant child. He had not been convicted of any major sex offenses before, though he had previously sexually molested a 15-year-old babysitter, but was never accused before the murder of Lisa. It took 9 months of questioning and testing until Turner finally confessed on August 8, 1974, to the rape and murder of Lisa. During those 9 months of scrutiny from police, he was brought in by law enforcement to perform a polygraph exam, but the results came back inconclusive, and Turner declined to participate in a second exam. Police had also collected body hair and bedspread fiber samples from Turner, which were positively matched to samples on Lisa's body and her clothing. In his 1974 confession, Turner stated that when he saw Lisa in his doorway, he was highly sexually motivated. He said he then led her into his bedroom, where he undressed Lisa and performed anal intercourse on her. Turner said that he noticed Lisa had stopped breathing after the sexual assault. He put his head over her chest and noticed that her heart was still beating. He attempted to revive her by placing his hands over her chest and listening to her chest again until Penn had driven up to the house. Gerald Turner was taken into police custody on August 9, 1974, and was convicted on February 4, 1975, by a jury on the charges of second-degree murder, enticing a child for immoral purposes, and acts of sexual perversion. He was sentenced to 38 years and 6 months in prison. The case devastated the Fond du Lac community and sent shockwaves through the state of Wisconsin. Parents who'd felt safe letting their children trick-or-treat alone suddenly realized predators could be living right in their neighborhoods. The murder caused more stringent daylight trick-or-treating hours in Wisconsin communities. Lisa had been a happy fourth grader at Chegwin Elementary School and a member of the Girl Scouts who loved playing with friends. Her parents described her as trusting and friendly, qualities that Gerald Turner exploited to take her life. But Turner's story didn't end with his conviction. He was first paroled on October 13, 1992, for good behavior after serving only 17 years and 8 months of his sentence at Waupun Correctional Institution. Turner's 1992 parole sparked multiple community protests and public outrage among Lisa's relatives and residents of Milwaukee, where he was living in a halfway house during his first parole. This prompted lawmakers to create the Sexual Predator Law. Wisconsin Chapter 980, nicknamed Turner's Law, which was ratified on May 26, 1994, by Wisconsin Governor Tommy Thompson. This law allows criminals who have been paroled or released from their prison sentences to be detained in mental institutions if they are deemed to have a substantial probability of committing another crime. Turner was sent back to prison on November 23, 1993, after a Department of Corrections appeal ruled that they had miscalculated his mandatory parole release from his good behavior. On January 29, 1998, after a 4-day trial, a jury ruled that Turner was not a violent sexual predator, meaning he could not be held at a treatment center under Turner's Law, and could begin his mandatory second parole that year. In July 1998, a judge ruled against an unsuccessful attempt to revoke his parole after a June incident in which Turner had shouted and waved a butcher knife at his caseworker while at his halfway home, although a psychiatrist ruled him to still be a dangerous individual. Turner was returned to prison for 15 additional years after violating his parole in 2003, when an abundance of pornographic content was discovered in his possession. After serving this extended sentence, Turner was scheduled to be mandatorily released fully from Racine Correctional Institution without any parole restrictions on February 1, 2018. Turner's impending release caused Lisa Ann French's mother to create an online petition in an effort to keep Turner incarcerated in a mental treatment facility. The petition received over 34,000 signatures. The Wisconsin Department of Justice filed a legal petition on January 26, 2018, prior to his mandatory prison release, to make the case that Turner should be detained under Wisconsin, Chapter 980. After multiple postponements and legal appeals, on February 23, 2022, Judge Paul Chisney ultimately denied Turner's release, ruling to condemn Turner to residency at a high-security mental health facility, where he remains today. In an undated letter Turner wrote to Lisa after her death, he depicted the events. "I doubt that I could ever fully realize the terror you experienced at my hands. I can still see you standing in the doorway with that felt hat, beaming at having recognized me. Then I see the delight in your eyes turn to fear as I close the door behind you." He wrote, "The rest of my life I will have to live with what I did to you. On that night, I became a monster. I do swear to you on the forfeiture of my life, I will never harm another child." Turner had at one time suggested that because he committed the crimes on Halloween, he received more significance for the crime, once quoting, "If it had happened on some other day, like Valentine's Day, nobody would have gave a damn." Lisa Ann French was 9 years old, excited about candy and costumes, and she became a victim of evil that lived right in her own neighborhood. Her murder changed Halloween safety practices across Wisconsin and inspired legislation that continues to protect communities from sexual predators today. Case number 7, Shirley Ledford, the Toolbox Killer's Halloween victim. Shirley Ledford was 16 years old and full of life. She lived in the Los Angeles area and spent Halloween night 1979 at a party with friends in the suburban Sunland Tujunga neighborhood. When the party ended, Shirley decided to hitchhike home, which was a common practice for teenagers in 1970s California. but one that would cost Shirley her life in the most brutal way imaginable. Shirley stood outside a gas station, thumb out, hoping for a quick ride home. A silver GMC Vandura van pulled up beside her. Inside were two men, 39-year-old Lawrence Bittaker and 31-year-old Roy Norris. Investigators believe Shirley accepted the ride because she recognized Bittaker. He was known to have frequented the McDonald's restaurant, where Shirley worked part-time as a waitress. Having no idea she'd just climbed into a vehicle operated by two of the most sadistic serial killers in American history, Shirley sealed her fate. Bittaker and Norris had been planning their crimes for years. They'd met in prison in 1977 at California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo, while both were serving time for previous crimes. Bittaker was there for assault, with a deadly weapon after stabbing a supermarket employee. Norris was serving time for rape and assault. They'd bonded over their shared deviant fantasies about sexual violence and misogyny, and made a pact. When they both got out, they'd work together to kidnap, torture, rape, and murder teenage girls. They wanted one victim for each teen year, from 13 to 19. After their releases in 1978 and 79, Bittaker bought the silver van they nicknamed Murder Mac. They equipped it with a bed in the back and kept it stocked with beer and marijuana to lure victims. They gathered tools, pliers, ice picks, wire coat hangers, and sledgehammers that they planned to use to torture their victims. These tools, normally found in a household toolbox, would later earn them the nickname the Toolbox Killers. And then they started hunting. Shirley Ledford was their fifth and final victim. The four previous girls, 16-year-old Lucinda Schaefer, 18-year-old Andrea Hall, 15-year-old Jackie Gilliam, and 13-year-old Jacqueline Leah Lamp, had all been kidnapped, tortured, and murdered between June and September 1979. Each crime had been more brutal than the last, as Bittaker and Norris experimented with different ways to inflict pain. Shirley's ordeal was particularly horrific because Bittaker and Norris recorded the audio of her torture and murder on a cassette tape. They wanted to be able to relive the experience later. The recording captured Shirley's screams, her begging for her life, and the sounds of the tools being used on her body. After Norris bound and gagged Shirley with construction tape, Bittaker drove the van aimlessly for over an hour while he remained in the back, torturing her. He slapped and mocked her, beat her with his fists, and struck her with a hammer. He tortured her with pliers, repeatedly raped and sodomized her, all while she screamed and pleaded, "No! Don't touch me!" Norris later described hearing screams, constant screams, emanating from the rear of the van as he drove. When Norris switched places with Bittaker, he turned on the tape recorder and encouraged Shirley to scream. He then struck her left elbow with a sledgehammer. When she screamed that he had broken her elbow and pleaded with him not to hit her again, Norris proceeded to strike her 25 consecutive times on the same elbow with the sledgehammer. The brutality was beyond comprehension. After approximately 2 hours of captivity and torture, Norris killed Shirley by strangling her with a wire coat hanger, which he tightened with pliers. An autopsy would later reveal she had died of strangulation after receiving extensive blunt force trauma to her face, head, breasts, and left elbow. Her genitalia and rectum had been torn, caused in part by Bittaker having inserted pliers inside her body. Rather than disposing of her body in the mountains like their previous victims, Bittaker decided to discard Shirley's body on a random lawn to view the reaction from the press. The pair drove to a randomly selected house in Sunland, where Norris placed Shirley's body on a bed of ivy on the front lawn. Her body was discovered by a jogger the following morning. The breakthrough in the case came through a friend named Joseph Jackson. Norris had become reacquainted with Jackson, an individual with whom he had previously been incarcerated. In November 1979, Norris confided in Jackson about the murders, providing graphic details. Jackson consulted his attorney, who advised him to inform authorities. Jackson agreed, and his information led to both men's arrests on November 20th, 1979. Searching Bittaker's van and their residences, police found the audio recordings, Polaroid photographs of victims, and the tools used in the murders. They also found items belonging to the victims, including a bracelet Norris had taken from Shirley's body as a souvenir. The evidence was overwhelming. Roy Norris agreed to testify against Bittaker in exchange for a sentence of life with possibility of parole instead of the death penalty. He pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, 2 counts of rape, and 1 count of robbery on March 18, 1980. He was sentenced to 45 years to life on May 7, 1980. Lawrence Bittaker's trial began on January 19, 1981. The most damning evidence was a 17-minute section of the audio tape of Shirley's torture. When it was played in court on January 29th, prosecutor Stephen Kay forewarned the jury, "For those of you who do not know what hell is like, you will find out." More than 100 people were present in the courtroom. Many members of both the jury and the audience wept openly, with several rushing out before the tape finished. Bittaker smiled throughout the duration of the recording. On February 17, 1981, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury found Bittaker guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder and numerous other charges. After just 90 minutes of deliberation on sentencing, the jury sentenced him to death. On March 24th, Judge Thomas Fredericks formally sentenced Bittaker to death, with an alternative sentence of 199 years and 4 months imprisonment. Lawrence Bittaker spent 38 years on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he died of natural causes on December 13, 2019, at age 79, without ever being executed. Roy Norris died of natural causes at California Medical Facility on February 24, 2020, at age 72, having been denied parole multiple times. The audio cassette Bittaker and Norris created of Shirley Ledford's torture remains in the possession of the FBI Academy, where it is used to train and desensitize FBI agents to the raw reality of torture and murder. FBI Special Agent John Edward Douglas described Bittaker as the most disturbing individual for whom he has ever created a criminal profile. Shirley Ledford's murder on Halloween night 1979 represented the absolute worst of human evil. She'd been at a party having fun, made the common decision to hitchhike home, and ended up in the hands of 2 monsters who tortured her to death while recording her agony for their own entertainment. Case number 8. Chris Jenkins, the smiley face mystery. 21-year-old Chris Jenkins was a popular college student at the University of Minnesota, studying business and playing lacrosse. He was well-liked, athletic, and had a bright future ahead of him. Halloween night 2002, Chris went out with friends to bars near campus in Minneapolis. By the end of the night, he'd vanished without a trace. Chris spent that Halloween evening bar hopping in the Dinkytown area near the university. Around midnight, he was escorted out of the Lone Tree Bar and Grill, apparently quite inebriated. It's unclear exactly why he was kicked out, though it may have been related to an argument with his girlfriend. He left alone, and no one ever saw Chris alive again. Chris's friends and family immediately knew something was wrong when he didn't return to his dorm. Chris was responsible and always stayed in touch. His parents, Jan and Steve Jenkins, drove from Lakeville, Minnesota to Minneapolis the next morning to search for their son. They filed a missing persons report and began organizing search parties. The Minneapolis Police Department initially treated Chris's disappearance as a case involving a drunk college student. When his body was eventually found, they would initially conclude his death was an accident or suicide, possibly stemming from his argument with his girlfriend that night. The department's handling of the case would later become a major point of criticism. 4 months passed with no sign of Chris. His family never stopped searching, posting flyers throughout Minneapolis and organizing volunteer searches of the area. They hired private investigators and consulted with psychics, desperate for any lead that might bring their son home. On February 27, 2003, a body was discovered in the Mississippi River between 3rd Avenue Bridge and St. Anthony Falls, wedged between some logs. The body was identified as Chris Jenkins. The Hennepin County Medical Examiner ruled Chris's death an accidental drowning or possible suicide, concluding that he'd likely been intoxicated, wandered to the river, and drowned. But Chris's family and several retired NYPD detectives who later reviewed the case believed the evidence pointed to something far more sinister. The retired detectives, Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte, had been investigating a series of similar drowning deaths of college-aged men across the Midwest. Young men would go out drinking, disappear from bars, and then turn up dead in rivers weeks or months later. Local authorities consistently ruled these deaths accidental drownings, but Gannon and Duarte saw patterns that suggested something else. The detectives found graffiti of smiley faces near many of the locations where bodies were recovered. They theorized that a group of killers, possibly a gang or cult, were targeting young, athletic college men and drowning them intentionally. The media dubbed this the smiley face killer theory, though law enforcement agencies largely rejected it as conspiracy thinking. In Chris Jenkins's case specifically, several details troubled his family. His Halloween costume remained remarkably intact. His slip-on shoes were still on his feet, and his shirt remained tucked in, which seemed unusual given the circumstances. Some reports suggested his arms were crossed over his chest when found, raising questions about how he entered the water. Most significantly, in November 2006, nearly 4 years after Chris's death, the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office changed their ruling from accidental drowning to homicide. The change came after a jailhouse confession in 2005, when a man imprisoned for another crime told police he'd been present when Chris was killed during a mugging gone wrong. Minneapolis police publicly apologized to Chris's family for mistakes made during the initial investigation. In 2007, law enforcement passed a suspect's name to the county attorney, hoping to bring charges. However, the attorney declined, feeling there wasn't enough evidence for a conviction. No one has ever been charged with Chris's murder, and the case remains officially unsolved. The FBI investigated the smiley face killer theory at the request of families whose sons had died in similar circumstances. In 2008, the Bureau released a statement saying they'd found no evidence of a serial killer or killers targeting college men. The FBI maintained that the deaths appeared to be tragic accidents involving alcohol and water. Chris Jenkins was 21 years old. He was responsible, athletic, and close with his family. His parents spent years fighting to have his death properly investigated, and even after getting the ruling changed to homicide, they never got answers about who killed their son or why. Whether the jailhouse confession was accurate, or whether something else happened that night may never be known. What is clear is that the initial investigation had significant shortcomings, and those failures meant potential evidence was lost, and any possible suspects had time to disappear. Case number 9. Teresa Halbach, the Making a Murderer case. 25-year-old Teresa Halbach was a photographer for Auto Trader magazine, traveling around Wisconsin to photograph vehicles for sale. She was cheerful, hardworking, and loved by her family and friends. October 31st, 2005. Teresa had several appointments scheduled to photograph cars. Her last appointment was at the Avery Auto Salvage Yard in Manitowoc County. She was never seen alive again. Teresa arrived at the Avery property that afternoon to photograph a minivan that was for sale. The person who'd made the appointment was Stephen Avery, who lived on the property in a small trailer. Stephen had spent 18 years in prison for a sexual assault he didn't commit before being exonerated by DNA evidence in 2002. He'd been free for just over 2 years when Teresa disappeared. Teresa's family reported her missing on November 3rd when they couldn't reach her for several days. Police began investigating immediately, and they quickly learned that Teresa's last known appointment had been at the Avery property. Investigators obtained a search warrant and descended on the salvage yard. On November 5th, searchers discovered Teresa's Toyota RAV4 hidden among the thousands of junked vehicles on the Avery property. The SUV had been partially concealed with branches and debris, as if someone had tried to hide it. Inside, investigators found blood, and the license plates had been removed. Stephen Avery became the prime suspect immediately. He'd been the last person known to see Teresa alive, and her vehicle was found on his property. Police obtained additional search warrants for Stephen's trailer and garage. In Stephen's trailer, investigators found a key to Teresa's RAV4 hidden in his bedroom. The key had Stephen's DNA on it, but strangely showed no trace of Teresa's D, which later became a point of controversy. In Stephen's garage, investigators found bullet fragments that tested positive for Teresa's DNA. Most damningly, investigators found charred bone fragments in a burn pit behind Stephen's trailer. Forensic analysis determined the bones were human, and DNA testing matched them to Teresa Halbach. Additional bone fragments and personal items belonging to Teresa were found in a burn barrel on the property. The evidence suggested Teresa had been shot in Stephen's garage, and then her body had been burned in the pit behind his trailer to destroy evidence. Her vehicle had been hidden on the property rather than driven away. Stephen was arrested and charged with first-degree intentional homicide. But there was another suspect who also drew investigators' attention: Stephen's 16-year-old nephew, Brendan Dassey. Police interrogated Brendan multiple times, and during these interrogations, Brendan confessed to helping Stephen kill and burn Teresa's body. The confessions were detailed and disturbing, though Brendan's intellectual disabilities and the aggressive nature of the interrogations later raised serious questions about their reliability. Stephen Avery's trial began in February 2007. Prosecutors presented the physical evidence: the key, the bones, the bullet fragments with Teresa's DNA, her vehicle hidden on his property. They argued that Stephen had lured Teresa to the salvage yard to attack her, and he'd killed her to eliminate a witness. Some reports suggested Teresa had previously been uncomfortable returning to the property, noting that Stephen had answered the door wearing just a towel during an earlier visit. Defense attorneys pointed out problems with the evidence. The key had appeared in Stephen's trailer only after multiple searches, suggesting it might have been planted. The bones in the burn pit were heavily fragmented and mixed with debris in a way that seemed inconsistent with a body being burned there. And prosecutors couldn't definitively prove how Teresa had been killed or exactly where the murder had taken place. The defense also highlighted Stephen's history with the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department. Stephen had sued the county for $36 million after his wrongful imprisonment, and several of the same officers who'd been involved in his original false conviction were now investigating Teresa's murder. The defense suggested police had framed Stephen again to avoid paying the lawsuit. The jury didn't buy the framing theory. In March 2007, they convicted Stephen Avery of first-degree intentional homicide. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. Brendan Dassey was tried separately in early 2007 and also convicted, receiving a life sentence. The case seemed closed until late 2015, when Netflix released a documentary series called Making a Murderer. The series examined Stephen's case in detail, highlighting potential evidence of police misconduct and raising questions about whether Stephen had actually committed the crime. The documentary sparked international debate about Stephen's guilt and whether he'd been framed by corrupt law enforcement. Alternative theories emerged, suggesting other possible suspects. Teresa's ex-boyfriend, Ryan Hillegas, was never formally questioned, despite his knowledge of her whereabouts and lack of an alibi. Some theorized that Stephen's other nephew, Bobby Dassey, and Bobby's stepfather, Scott Tadich, could have been involved and framed Stephen to divert suspicion. Stephen's new attorney, Kathleen Zellner, began filing appeals based on new forensic analysis and claims of planted evidence. She argued that someone else had killed Teresa, and police had manipulated evidence to frame Stephen. In 2017, Zellner filed a 1,272-page motion accusing Hillegas of the murder and demanding a retrial for Avery. But Wisconsin courts have consistently denied Stephen's appeals, and he remains in prison along with Brendan Dassey. Teresa Halbach's family has maintained throughout all the appeals and media attention that they believe Stephen Avery killed Teresa. They've asked for the legal process to end so they can have peace. Teresa's mother, Karen Halbach, has said the constant appeals and documentaries force the family to relive Teresa's murder over and over. Friends remembered Teresa as someone with genuine happiness and positivity. She really cared about people, said her former teacher, Stan Diedrich. She was always going to be a person that would be there to help. She just had a very outgoing personality, and she was always happy. Parents often asked Teresa to photograph their children, and she dreamed of becoming a mother herself one day. Teresa was 25 years old. She loved photography, spending time with her family, and had recently opened her own studio. She went to the Avery salvage yard to do her job on Halloween Day 2005, and she never left that property alive. Whether Stephen Avery is guilty beyond doubt, or whether he's the victim of a corrupt justice system, Teresa's death is the real tragedy. A young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Murdered and burned, her remains scattered across a junkyard. If you believe Teresa was failed by a system that may have prioritized an active lawsuit over finding the truth, like and comment. We all deserves the truth. Case number 10, Johnny Frank Garrett, a wrongful execution. 17-year-old Johnny Frank Garrett was arrested on November 9, 1981, for the rape and murder of 76-year-old Sister Tadia Ben. The crime had occurred on October 31st, Halloween night, at St. Francis Convent in Amarillo, Texas. Sister Tadia, a Catholic nun who dedicated her life to serving others, had been beaten, raped, and strangled in her bedroom. The brutality of the crime shocked the conservative Texas city, and police were under intense pressure to find the killer. Johnny came from a background of severe abuse and neglect that would later be described by mental health experts as one of the most virulent histories of abuse encountered in decades of practice. He had been raped by his stepfather, who then hired him out to another man for sex. From age 14, he was forced to perform bizarre sexual acts and participate in pornographic films. Family members introduced him to alcohol and drugs at age 10, and he subsequently abused brain-damaging substances like paint thinner and amphetamines. He was regularly beaten and on one occasion was burned on a stove burner, resulting in severe scarring. Johnny suffered from multiple head injuries as a child that caused brain damage, and he was chronically psychotic with paranoid delusions. Police focused on Johnny after linking his fingerprints to evidence found at the crime scene. On November 9, 1981, Amarillo Police Detective Walter Yerger matched fingerprints found in Sister Benz's bedroom to Garrett, who lived across the street from the convent. Yerger already knew Johnny from investigating a burglary case. At trial, prosecutors presented physical evidence connecting Johnny to the scene. Fingerprints found on a kitchen knife recovered from under Sister Benz's bed and on her bed's headboard matched Johnny's prints. Pubic hairs recovered from the scene had the same characteristics as Johnny's. A steak knife found in the convent driveway matched another steak knife from Johnny's home in manufacture, design, and wear. Police also presented an unsigned confession they claimed Johnny gave them, but refused to sign. In that statement, Johnny allegedly admitted to breaking into the convent, choking Sister Benz until she passed out, having sex with her, and leaving. Johnny denied making this statement. Additionally, a jailhouse informant named Lonnie Watley, a trustee at Potter County Jail, where Johnny was held pre-trial, testified that Johnny initially denied the offense, but eventually admitted to breaking into the convent and killing the nun. Johnny testified in his own defense, claiming he had entered the convent 2 days before the murder to steal items, entering through an unlocked front door around noon. He said he picked up a kitchen knife in the cafeteria and bent it, trying to pry open a locked drawer in a bedroom. He explained his fingerprints on Sister Benz's headboard by saying he grabbed it to reach across on the wall. He claimed he heard a noise and fled, and that he was at his mother's house from 10:20 p.m. October 30th until the next morning. Johnny's defense was inadequate. His attorney didn't properly investigate Johnny's background of abuse or present expert testimony about his severe mental disabilities and brain damage. Information about his abusive upbringing and mental health problems was not made available to the jury. They heard almost nothing about the severe trauma Johnny had experienced or how it had affected his development. The jury convicted Johnny Frank Garrett in August through September of 1982. Because the crime had been so brutal and the victim had been a nun, the jury showed no mercy. They sentenced Johnny to death. He was 17 years old at the time of the crime, one of the youngest people sentenced to death in America. Appeals dragged on for a decade, but Texas courts consistently upheld Johnny's conviction and sentence. Defense attorneys raised questions about his mental competency, arguing he was insane and suffered from multiple personality disorder as a result of childhood abuse. They argued that Johnny's age and mental disabilities made him ineligible for execution. Nothing worked. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, appealed on Johnny's behalf. Pope John Paul II asked for clemency through his representative in the United States. Governor Ann Richards granted Johnny a rare 30-day executive reprieve in January 1992, just an hour before his scheduled execution. However, after a clemency hearing, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles voted 17-0, with one abstention, to retain the death sentence. On February 11, 1992, Johnny Frank Garrett was executed by lethal injection at age 28. He'd spent over 10 years on death row for a crime committed when he was 17 years old. His last words were reportedly, "I'd like to thank my family for loving me and taking care of me, and the rest of the world can kiss my ass." Serious doubts about Johnny's guilt emerged after his execution. The case had involved Ralph Erdman, West Texas's main forensic pathologist in the 1980s, who later pleaded no contest to falsifying autopsies and tampering with evidence. Erdman's felony conviction raised questions in dozens of cases he'd handled, including Johnny's. During the autopsy, Erdman had discarded semen samples, testifying at trial that he threw them away because no one told him to save them. Years after Johnny's execution, attorney Jesse Quackenbush began investigating the case. He discovered that another man, Leoncio Perez Rueda, a Cuban refugee, had been connected to a strikingly similar murder that occurred just 3 months before Sister Benz's death. Narnie Box Bryson, 77 years old, was raped and killed in July 1981 in the same part of Amarillo. The similarities were so striking that the district attorney and detectives at the time were convinced the same man killed both women. Rueda was later connected to Bryson's murder through DNA evidence and pleaded guilty in 2005. During an interview, Rueda reportedly described raping and beating a nun on Halloween night in 1981. Quackenbush created a documentary called The Last Word that examined Johnny's case and argued for his innocence. He pointed out that black hairs were found at both crime scenes, but Johnny was white with brown hair. He questioned the authenticity of the unsigned confession and the handling of evidence by Erdman. Advocacy groups have called for Johnny Frank Garrett to be posthumously exonerated, arguing that the evidence suggests he may not have committed the crime. However, Texas has no formal mechanism for exonerating people who've already been executed, so Johnny's conviction stands. Sister Tadea Benz was 76 years old, a gentle nun who devoted her life to God and helping others. She was raped and murdered in her own bedroom on Halloween night, 1981. The person who killed her deserved to be caught and punished. Whether Johnny Frank Garrett was guilty or innocent remains disputed, but what is clear is that he suffered severe abuse throughout his childhood, had significant mental disabilities, and brain damage. And these factors were never properly presented to the jury that sentenced him to death. His execution at age 28 for a crime committed at 17, given his mental state and the questions about the evidence, represents one of the most controversial cases in Texas's use of capital punishment. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know if you think Johnny was innocent, or if the justice system fell short for both him and Sister Tadea. These 10 Halloween crime stories remind us that horror isn't just found in scary movies and haunted houses. Real monsters walk among us, and they don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like fathers, taking their kids trick-or-treating, or older brothers with mental health struggles, or wealthy neighbors, or frightened homeowners, or friendly people offering rides. The scariest thing about these cases is how ordinary the killers seemed before they took innocent lives. And for the families left behind, Halloween never feels the same. Every October 31st brings back memories of the last time they saw their loved one alive. The decorations and costumes that should represent fun become painful reminders. While other families are enjoying candy and parties, these families are remembering the worst night of their lives. The victims in these cases all deserved better than what they got. They deserved to live full lives, to celebrate more Halloweens, to grow old surrounded by people who loved them. Instead, they became names in true crime stories, their deaths studied and discussed by strangers decades later. Some of their killers were caught and punished. Others escaped justice through wealth, legal technicalities, or deaths in prison before execution. And in at least one case, the wrong person may have been executed while the real killer walked free. The justice system works sometimes, but these cases show how often it fails, how it can be corrupted by money, incompetence, prejudice, or simple human error. What these stories teach us goes beyond not trusting strangers on Halloween or checking your kids' candy. They teach us that evil takes many forms, that justice is never guaranteed, and that the people we trust most can sometimes be the most dangerous. They teach us that mental illnesses needs proper treatment, that wealth shouldn't determine who faces consequences, that our obsessions aren't worth taking human life, that fear can be as deadly as hatred, that predators hide in plain sight, and that sometimes the truth never fully comes to light. Halloween will keep coming every October 31st. Kids will keep dressing in costumes and collecting candy. But these 10 families will forever associate that date with loss, grief, and questions that may never be fully answered. Their stories are reminders that tragedy doesn't take holidays, and that the monsters in real life are far more terrifying than anything Hollywood could ever create or writers will ever write about. If you believe every affected family in this story deserves the truth, not just convenient answers, comment "Justice for all." Only trolls and people who side with broken systems won't.
I want to thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you're going to love what's coming next. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for instant updates on our latest videos. See you in the next one.